Welcome to Sticky Med, learning medicine, stick by stick.
If you're the kind of person who really dives into clinical trials, maybe for a new cancer therapy or a cardiology breakthrough, you always run into this one specific graph. It looks, a little complicated, but it basically holds the entire story of the study.
It really does.
So today, we are doing a deep dive into the Kaplan-Meier curve.
And this curve is, it's really the secret language of survival statistics.
Secret language, I like that.
It's the tool that medical researchers use to answer the most fundamental question about a new treatment. Not just if people survive, but for how long.
And what's so fascinating is that the medical community relies on this specific visual because, well, simple numbers can lie.
Oh, absolutely.
You might hear a headline, something like, new drug achieves 70% 5-year survival. And that sounds great.
Sounds amazing.
But that 1%, it hides two huge critical pieces of information. The very things that tell you if a drug is a real breakthrough or just, a marginal help.
It totally does. A simple number tells you nothing about the velocity of the outcome, how quickly things went wrong, or how they dealt with the real-world messiness of a long study.
So our mission today is to crack the code on this thing. By the end of this, you won't just see a line graph. You'll be able to read that descending staircase, understand the statistics behind it, and know exactly what to ask the next time a big drug trial comes out.
Let's do it. And I think the place to start is with the mindset shift you need. You have to stop counting heads at a finish line and start thinking about time to event analysis.
Time to event. Okay, so that's the key concept right there.
It is.
We're not just tracking who made it to 5 years, we're tracking when the key event actually happened for every single person.
Whether that event is death or disease progression or a relapse.
And that's what fixes the huge flaw in those simple survival studies you mentioned.
Right. So imagine two different cancer studies. Both of them, on paper, achieve 70% survival at 5 years.
Okay, 70% for both. Sounds identical.
But in study A, the 30% who didn't make it, they died almost right away, within, say, the first 6 months.
Oh.
The other 70% then lived for the full 5 years. But in study B, patients started dying much later, mostly in years 4 and 5.
Ah, I see it now. So drug A from study A that actually brought people 4.5 extra years of good life.
A huge amount of time.
But drug B was just barely holding on. The final number is the same, 70%, but the clinical benefit of drug A is just, it's exponentially higher.
Exactly. The Kaplan-Meier curve is designed to show you that timeline, moment by moment. It shows the velocity.
And what about the second flaw, the incomplete data problem?
This is a massive practical issue. People join studies at different times.
Right.
A patient who joins in year 3 can't possibly get to the 5-year endpoint before the study closes. So what do you do with their data?
In a simple percentage, you'd probably just have to throw it out, wouldn't you?
Or wait for years. The Kaplan-Meier method is designed to use all that valuable partial data. It calculates survival probability continuously every single time an event happens.
So it's like a living calculation of risk. It's dynamic, not just one static snapshot at the end.
Which brings us to what it actually looks like. If you see a Kaplan-Meier curve, it's always a descending staircase.
Right. It's not a smooth diagonal line. It's all these little steps going down.
And that staircase structure tells you a story right away.
Okay, so let's break down that architecture.
Well, the horizontal axis, the x-axis, that's always time. But you need to check the scale. Is it in months, days, years?
That's a good point. A small improvement over 3 years could look really dramatic if the axis is just 30 months long.
Precisely. And the vertical axis, the y-axis, that's always survival probability. It starts at 1.0 or 100%.
So top left corner, everyone is alive.
Correct. And then every time you see a vertical drop, that's an event. A patient died or their tumor grew or whatever endpoint the study is tracking.
So the vertical drops are the bad news.
They're the events. And the line stays flat horizontally between those drops because no new events are happening. People are just surviving.
Okay, so the visual is immediate. If that staircase takes a big nosedive early on,
that's a clear sign of poor early survival. A bunch of deep, steep steps right at the beginning is bad.
But if the slope is really gentle and the curve stays high for a long time,
that means the treatment is working well. You're seeing a high survival probability over a long time. It lets you just see the rate of attrition.
It's actually amazing how much you can tell just from the shape. But let's get to the trickiest part, the thing you call the genius of the method, how it handles all that messy real-world data. We're talking about censoring.
Yeah, censoring is why this curve actually works in the real world. In studies that go on for years, you can't expect every single person to stay in it perfectly.
People move, they drop out.
And the most common type is called right censoring.
Right censoring. Okay, what's that?
That's when a patient leaves the data for any reason before they've had the event we're tracking.
So, like, they move away and you can't contact them anymore.
That's one. Or the study just ends and they're still alive. That's another. Or they withdraw their consent. Or, and this is important, they die from something completely unrelated.
Like a car accident?
A car accident, a stroke. If you're tracking cancer progression, you can't count that as a cancer event.
So you can't say they died of the disease, but you also can't just keep counting them as at risk anymore.
Exactly. And here's the brilliant part of the math. We count them as alive and at risk up to the very last day we have confirmed data for them.
Okay.
And after that day, they are simply removed from the denominator, the pool of people still at risk of the event.
Wait, but that feels like we're making a big assumption. If someone moves away in year 2, aren't we potentially biasing the curve?
How so?
Well, what if the healthiest people are the ones who feel good enough to relocate? Then the people left in the study might be sicker, and the drug could look weaker than it is. How do you guard against that?
That is an excellent critique, and it's the core assumption of the whole method. We have to assume that the reasons for censoring are random or uninformative.
Uninformative, meaning the reason they left isn't related to their outcome in the study?
Exactly, like the study ending or moving for a new job. If the censoring is uninformative, the data holds up beautifully.
But what if it's not? What if a lot of people drop out late in the study? That assumption gets pretty shaky, doesn't it?
It does, and that's why you have to look for the tick marks on the curve.
The little vertical dashes on the flat parts of the steps.
Yes. Each one of those little ticks represents a censored patient. If you see a few here and there, that's normal. But if you see that the curve is winding down to the end and it's just covered in tick marks,
That's a warning sign.
a huge warning sign. It means your conclusion at the end is based on a tiny, maybe biased group of remaining patients.
So the curve uses every scrap of data, but we need to watch those ticks to make sure it's not getting biased.
It's why it's the standard. It makes the most of every single day of follow-up from every person.
Okay, now for the fun part, comparing two curves. We usually see a red line for the new drug and a blue line to the placebo or standard care.
And the first, simplest thing to do is just look at the gap between them.
The vertical distance?
Yep. The wider that gap is, the bigger the benefit of the new treatment. You want to see that red line stay high, way above the blue line.
But there's a big visual red flag to look out for, right?
Yep.
Something that signals trouble.
Yes, you need to watch out for crossing lines.
If the two curves cross over each other,
If they cross, it means the benefit isn't consistent. Maybe the drug worked great for a year, but then its effect wore off. Or worse, it started causing harm later on compared to the control.
so a truly effective treatment, those lines should split apart early and then just stay apart.
They should never, ever touch again. Crossing lines means you have a much more complex and often problematic story to tell.
Okay, so beyond the visual gap, there's one number that always makes the headlines, the median survival time.
This is the key clinical number, but it's really simple to find on the graph.
How do you do it?
You find 0.5 or 50% on that vertical y-axis.
Got it.
Then you draw a straight line across until you hit the curve you're interested in, and from that point, you just drop a vertical line straight down to the time axis, the x-axis.
And whatever time that is, that's your median survival.
That's it. It's the point in time where half the patients in that group have had the event and the other half are still alive.
So if drug A has a median survival of 36 months and the placebo is 18 months, that's a huge, clear difference.
Massive. And here's where the language can get really optimistic. If a treatment is super successful, the curve might not even drop below 50% by the end of the study.
But you can't draw the line.
You can't. In that case, the researchers will report the median survival as undefined or not reached.
And that is the absolute best case scenario, isn't it?
It's the gold standard. It means after 5 years or however long the study was, more than half the people on that treatment were still doing great.
Okay, but we have to move from just looking at it, from the red line looks higher, to actual statistical proof.
Right. In science, we can't just trust our eyes. We have to prove that gap isn't just random chance.
And that's where the heavy stats come in. First up is the log rank test. What is that doing?
The log rank test is what gives you the all-important p-value for the difference between the curves.
The p-value.
What it does is it looks at every single time point where an event occurred. And at each of those points, it compares the observed number of deaths in the treatment group
The number that actually happened.
versus the expected number of deaths if there was truly no difference between the two drugs. That's the null hypothesis.
So if the drug works, the actual number of deaths should be way lower than the expected number.
Exactly. And the log-rank test crunches all that and spits out a p-value. If we want to prove the drug works, we need that p-value to be very small.
And the magic number is usually less than 0.05.
P less than 0.05 is the threshold we use to say the curves are significantly different. It's not just noise.
Okay, so the p-value tells us if the difference is real. But it doesn't tell us how much better the drug is.
Correct. For the magnitude, we need the hazard ratio. Right.
Hazard ratio.
Yeah,
I'd argue this is the most insightful number, but maybe the most misunderstood.
I agree. Because unlike median survival, which is a single point in time, the HR gives you a relative measure of risk at any given moment.
Instantaneous risk. That's the key.
Yes. The HR compares the rate at which events are happening in one group versus the other continuously over the whole study. It's like comparing the steepness of the curves at all times.
Give us the simple way to interpret the number itself.
Okay. An HR of 1 means the risks are equal. The drug did nothing. An HR of 0.7. That means at any given moment, a patient on the new drug has a 30% lower risk of the event happening compared to someone on the placebo.
So a low number is good. You want a below 1.
Way below 1. And if the HR is above 1,
That's really bad.
that's really bad. An HR of 2.0 means the drug is doubling the instantaneous risk. So you're looking for that magic combo, a low p-value and a hazard ratio that's significantly below 1.0.
Now, a quick warning here. Sometimes you see a study that has a statistically significant p-value. The difference is real, but the HR is something like 0.95.
Right. And that's a small, real difference. It means you have to ask a different question. Is a 5% reduction in risk clinically meaningful?
Especially when you factor in side effects or cost.
Exactly. The stats prove a difference exists, but the HR helps you decide if that difference actually matters in a patient's life.
That's a great way to put it. Okay, let's wrap this all up. Let's create a quick checklist for anyone reading one of these curves.
4 things to check. First, check the axis.
Is the time in months or years? Don't let a short time scale fool you into thinking an effect is bigger than it is.
Second, check the ticks. Look for those censoring marks. If the tail end of the curve is all ticks and just a few patients, be very skeptical of that data.
Third, find the median. Go to that 50% line, draw across, and drop down. It gives you that big headline number.
And finally, check the statistical proof. Is the p-value less than 0.05? And what's the hazard ratio? You want to see an HR well below 1.0.
This whole technique, it really does maximize the power of the data you have. And I think the most optimistic part of it all is that a treatment can be so good, the median survival is undefined.
It's the goal. It's the closest we get in research to showing a truly long-term positive outcome.
Understanding all this really moves you from just reading a headline to actually being able to interpret the medical evidence for yourself.
It lets you distinguish a small, fleeting benefit from a true, long-lasting clinical breakthrough.
That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Go forth and read those survival statistics with confidence.